to make love to her.
Hello there, here is Shock with Fighting for Her Chapter 5. I'm sorry that I haven't updated for like a month. School just started and I didn't have time. I read all your reviews about my lemon suggestion, and I've decided that a lemon will certainly be in this story, but I don't yet know when. But for now, enjoy Chapter 5. Steve walked slowly and nervous towards the cabin of Peggy Carter. He was not exactly sure what was going to happen, but being alone with Carter could mean that Hodge might try to interfere. But Charles said before he left, "Don't worry, I will keep Hodge away from whatever may happen between Carter and you." Steve believed him on his word. He stood before the door of her barracks. He was still unsure about everything. He didn't know what Peggy wanted. He only hoped she wasn't mad at him for some reason or another. He opened the door and walked in. Peggy sat there on the bed, apparently waiting for him.
"Glad you're here,"
she said. Steve felt like his mouth was tight shut. He couldn't say anything.
"Sit down,"
she said. Steve silently walked to the bed before and sat on it. He still didn't say anything. Outside the cabin, Charles Beckett stood outside looking from left to right. He promised Steve he would watch for Hodge. He didn't know if he was about to interfere their meeting. He didn't even know if Hodge knew about their meeting. But no matter what the case was, he would keep Hodge away. For minutes he saw nothing, until he saw movement in the shadows. He walked after it. Back with Steve and Peggy, Steve still didn't say anything. Peggy stared at him and raised her eyebrow.
"Steve, do you know why I called you here?"
Peggy asked. Steve looked to the ground. "No," he said. Peggy grabbed his head softly and made him look at her.
"It's respectful to look at people when you're in a conversation,"
she said. Steve nodded. "Of course, sorry about that, Agent Carter. I'm just nervous," he said. Peggy smiled.
"Call me Peggy. We're not on the training ground,"
she said. Steve nodded and tried hard to look into her eyes, her beautiful eyes, but he was still nervous like never before.
"Well, the reason I called you here, first of all, if you didn't give me that cure, then that could be fatal for me. My allergy to azaleas is so bad, I could be laying in the hospital by now. So, you practically saved my life, and I want to make it up to you,"
she told him. "And how do you wanna do that?" Steve asked, nervous. Peggy smiled. Her hands went to her brown vest and slowly she unbuttoned it. Button by button came undone, and Steve could already see her white undershirt. He thought he was going to pass out soon. Outside the cabin, Beckett followed the movements silently and slowly. He thought it was Hodge that would be logical. But when he got a clear view of the culprit, he could see it wasn't him. It was a man taller than Hodge, and the man was a little tanned. Charles didn't know who it was. All he knew was that he wasn't going to become good friends with him. Oh. With Steve and Peggy, Steve thought he was going to pass out when he saw Peggy unbutton her vest. When she finally got all the buttons loose, she took it off and threw it on the ground. Now her white undershirt was visible. She then proceeded to take off her white undershirt, but Steve suddenly said, "Wait, what are you doing?" Peggy looked at him.
"I want to pay you back, and this is the way I think is the best,"
she said. She took both sides of her white undershirt and pulled it over her head, revealing a black bra. "Peggy, I'm not really sure. I feel this is kind of disrespectful towards you," Steve said. Peggy raised her eyebrow.
"Disrespectful? Steve, I offer this to you. Then it isn't disrespectful,"
she said. Her hands went to her back, but she stopped and stared at Steve.
"Do you want me to stop?"
she asked sweet. Steve only stared at her. Suddenly she said,
"Who is silent agrees,"
and unclasped her bra. Steve gasped a little. Peggy smiled and removed her bra completely, revealing her plump and ripe with her hard nipples. Steve felt like his nose was gonna bleed. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. Ah! Mmm! Steve brought out. Peggy stood up and walked to the bed he sat on. She took his hand and placed it on her right. Steve's mind was now going into overdrive. The feeling of her soft was driving him to the brink of passing out. Steve felt another hand on the back of his head. He looked Peggy's way and she forced her lips directly on his. Steve at first was surprised, but after a minute or so, he returned the kiss, while Peggy used his hand to fondle her.
She looked into Steve's eyes and let go of his hand that left her beast.
"Kiss them?"
she asked. Steve was confused. Peggy slowly lowered his head to her right beast. Steve didn't bother to move away.
"To start, give it a small lick,"
she said. Steve obeyed her and slowly ran his tongue over a few times. Peggy then pulled his head further, forcing Steve to take her into his mouth. Steve still slowly licked and suckled her. Peggy moaned a little at the pleasure she was receiving. It continued for about a minute before Peggy released his head and Steve left her, but immediately began to suck on her other.
Yeah, you do. It. So good,"
she moaned. The pleasure was great, and he did it with love instead of lust. And then suddenly a shot was heard. At instinct, Steve took his mouth of her and pulled her to the ground.
"What was that?"
Peggy said in panic. "Don't know, but I go and look," Steve said, and ran outside of the cabin. He looked around, but saw nobody. Then he heard another shot, and quickly he got on the ground. He looked around and saw Charles running to him. "Everything all right, man?" he asked. Steve got up and said, "Yes, man." "Who fired that shot? Was it Hodge?" Charles looked around. "No, it was someone else, but I don't know who it was," he said. Peggy came out of her cabin.
"What's going on?"
she asked. Charles and Steve turned around. "Sorry, Agent Carter, I didn't mean to bother you, but I suddenly had a shot and ran towards this place to see from who it was. But I found nothing," Charles told.
"Oh, that's all right, Beckett. Thanks for trying to help. But I suggest you better go back to your barracks,"
Peggy said. Charles noticed a little wet spot on her brown vest, but didn't bother to ask. Peggy walked back into her cabin and Steve and Charles left for their barracks. "So, how did it go, Steve?" Charles asked. Steve was unsure if he had to tell Charles about everything that happened back there. "Charles, I think I tell you later," Steve said. "Once again, I'm sorry I haven't updated in a while. So what do you think of this chapter? My first attempt at a small smut or something. The lemon chapter will be later. I first need to learn how to write it. But don't worry, it will come. Oh, and from now on, this story is gonna be rated M. I hope you liked this chapter. This was Lord Shockwave.
I could love you, babe, until the crying shame.